Just a spoiler warning about this upcoming interview. We'll be talking about The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens, which is a visual novel, and we'll be talking about the whole thing, so there's going to be some pretty big spoilers. If you want to play it before watching the interview, you can find it at heiden.itch.io. Hello, I'm Greg Livingston, and I am here with the developer for The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Heiden. I made The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens, as well as some other narrative visual novel games.
All right. And how would you describe The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens?
The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens is a game I made in 48 hours, in which it's sort of a atmospheric game in which a girl wakes up in a strange place with no memory. Through playing through the game multiple times, you slowly uncover the full story of what happened there.
All right. So the first thing that was on my mind about this was that it kind of has a weird two-act structure where you first go through the game without any characters, and after that you go back through and you meet some supporting cast. And I was wondering why you chose that approach for the story.
Yeah, so when I sat down to make this game, the one of the main things I wanted to focus on, I wanted to play with persistent memory, which is sort of the replaying ability, which I'll probably talk about later. And then also, I really wanted to focus on atmosphere. So I wanted it so that when players played it the first time, they could go through the different rooms clicking on things at their own pace without having to like read any dialogue and just sort of make their own ideas and conclusions about what they thought happened there without any sort of people telling them what to think or characters saying things. So the first act, you don't meet anybody because I sort of wanted it to be a little bit slower.
Okay. You wanted the game to be about atmosphere. Do you mean like a more of a passive observation of your surroundings rather than a back and forth interaction?
Right, or at least the first half, definitely. I wanted it to be sort of a passive event that, I mean, you go around clicking on things, but it's very much taking in sort of like images and such.
Right. And you brought up a phrase consist or persistent memory. What does
Uh-huh.
that mean?
So persistent memory is sort of data that it hangs over from play, like from one game to the next. So the application itself knows you've done certain things in certain parts of the game, even though it's not inside the active like game itself. So Undertale is a very popular example of if you open the game checks to see if you've gotten to a certain part of the plot. And if you have, it sort of rewrites the entire main menu and it like you can't even get to the continue section because it just reverts you somewhere else. And so I was playing with that same idea of sort of the game itself checks for variables outside of an active play session.
Okay, it's that breaching the fourth wall kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So actually, on that point, in most games, when you get kicked back to the title screen, you usually consider it a death. But in The Girl with the Gray Hair Awakens, your goal is to essentially get that state where you get kicked back to the main menu 5 times. So I was wondering, what were your thoughts on how that spoke to the fiction's themes, what the story and the dialogue is talking about?
Yeah, so I think the idea I was going for was sort of the idea of the girl is being told what to do and like what other people think of her. And so each time it's sort of like the fairies threatening her with you should do this because someone thinks this of you and because X, Y, and Z. And so every time she dies, it's sort of like them trying to force her into taking a decision by like sort of scaring her with these deaths that you come across.
So is there like a figurative girl with the gray hair that dies because like it's almost like her agency is passing away rather than the character themselves?
Yeah. So the girl with the gray hair, and the reason it's called that is because every single time you play it, the first sentence of the play session, it says, and the girl with the either gray or red or blue or yellow hair awakens. And so the first four times you sort of are being told to do things, and then the final time she speaks for herself, then she has a little bit more of an active role in the game there.
Right. Actually, now that you mentioned the hair color as well, I thought it was interesting. I didn't know what to make of it, that the world around her is colorful, and when she's being forced through these decisions, her hair matches the color of the world around her. But ultimately, the hair that belongs to her herself is colorless.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's like deeper meaning to that, but I did that because it was since I only had 48 hours. It's very easy to color and draw in something called monochromatic sort of color scheme. So everything has one hue, like with everything is yellow and just different shades of yellow. And so I actually did that to cut down time. So I knew I wanted the main room to be gray so I could easily color things all gray shades, which is easier for me than trying to add in different colors. And it also sort of acted as like sort of a clue as like, okay, she's got blue hair now. There's a blue room, a red room, and a yellow room. Probably you got to go to the red, or if she's got red hair, you have to go to like to the red room. Um, but that was my thought process behind that.
It's interesting then how the diegetic, the storytelling aspect of the hair color and the gameplay aspect of the hair color meet in that regard, where not only does it speak to her upcoming role in the story, where she's going to be forced to take some part of a teacup or
Hmm.
witness someone falling off a ledge or something like that, but it's also like a gameplay clue telling you which part of the environment to interact with.
Yeah, and I'm always really interested in trying to get narrative and gameplay to mesh well together. That's sort of like a topic I'm always trying to pursue in my own works. That I really like that intersection of sort of story complementing gameplay mechanics.
Yeah. All right. There's also a running motif of these aesthetically pleasant things that then get turned into dangerous objects. There's one room where there's a scarf hanging from a banister, and it turns out at the bottom is a dead body.
Hmm.
And then the king actually has this one-off line where he mentions that he's worried about tea that will scald his daughter. And there's more images like that, but it struck me that it kept coming up. I was wondering what you would say those reflect on.
Yeah, so that was sort of the idea of things that might seem perfect and nice on the outside are not always the case in truth. So it actually sort of goes back to the deal her father took. I guess spoilers. The main girl is the princess of the kingdom, and her father has made a deal with the fairies to protect the sort of the royalty from the fairies' attacks, but they're sacrificing their villagers to these creatures. So on the outside, everybody on the upper echelons of the society are quite fine, but it's actually sort of masking this underlying rotten core. And so it's sort of the idea of like the actual coming of age ceremony is her drinking out of a teacup, and it's sort of dainty and girlish if she's drinking tea from a teacup, and things just sort of seem nice and friendly, but in reality it's a deal she's making with the devil that the devil themselves are trying to get her to take against her will. So it sort of comes up with the idea of not everything is as it seems.
I guess in that case, really, you couldn't have a better villain than fairies.
Yeah, I like the idea of sort of fairies can either be these sort of whimsical, cutesy creatures, or in the actual lore, they're these terrifying creatures that play tricks and actually hurt people. I think it's quite interesting.
Huh. I didn't know about that, about the lore behind fairies, because when I saw it in the game, I was a little horrified that that's what they turned out to look like.
Oh, yeah, actually, can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's actually quite a lot of like folklore of fairies leading people to their death. But it's sort of they have this like two-faceted image in sort of media and such of we see like pinks and yellows and pretty dainty wings, but where they came from is quite different.
Okay. The girl with the gray hair was developed for a 48-hour game jam, right?
Yeah, I made up the jam because I had a weekend free, and I said, "Hey, I want to make a game." So it was a sort of a self-imposed game jam.
Sure. So, given that self-imposed time limit, did you have to limit the content that you wanted to put in the game?
I actually didn't. I don't think the actual story itself, I don't think would have survived if I had made it much longer. I think it's sort of a very short. I wrote it to be very short. I was actually influenced by something called flash fiction, which is the idea that you sit down and you write a story from the beginning to end in like a one sitting. And a lot of these stories are sort of like 300 words or sort of 1,000 words long. So I was inspired, and so from the very beginning of it, I knew I had 48 hours. I wanted to make the smallest plot I could and sort of like experiment and see what I could put in there to make it feel much more full, but also very short. So I didn't have to do a lot of art. I didn't have to draw a lot of characters. And I think the length it is, I think, is probably as long as it would probably last without having to add extra detail and a little bit more of player interactability. So yeah, I think I sort of designed it from the start to be this short.
Okay. So it was really going in, you knew you had a limited scope, and so that set your you were able to set your creative expectations accordingly.
Yeah.
So in that case, what made the three supporting characters important enough to feature in the game that they were the three?
Yeah, so I chose them because I wanted to sort of go up the social structure each time you played the game. So the first time you don't meet anybody and you get to sort of make your own assumptions of what happened. And then the second time you meet this angry man who is talking to the girl who now has red hair as if she's a maid. And so the first iteration, that male character, he was introduced as sort of an idea of introducing the idea of there being sort of a lower class working in what essentially becomes a castle. And then the second iteration, you meet a woman who thinks you're part of the lesser nobility. And originally, I think I had wanted her to be some sort of like mistress, but I thought that might complicate things a little bit too much. So she was just lesser nobility. So it's the idea of you going from a maid to a lesser nobility. And then the second to last playthrough, you meet the king, who is the girl's father, and he's at the top. And so you're sort of working yourself from the bottom all the way to the top. And then at the end, everything sort of becomes clear as the girl goes back to having the gray hair and you sort of see the full picture.
Yeah, I guess actually she's actually at the very top of the social ladder once she rejects the cup at the very end, right? When she takes the throne.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way. So I just personally have a lot more experience asking about or talking about, let's say, software experiences that are about winning and losing, or more real-time interactions with a software, with a piece of software. And visual novels are definitely not that. And so I realize visual novels won't appeal to everyone who likes, you know, who likes video games
Yeah.
for the Mario's and the Calls of Duty. But
Hmm.
I guess actually, what would you say in defense of, walking simulators and that kind of game? Like what, how would you express the meaning that they can provide?
Yeah. I think games, just like film and just like books, it's a medium and it's not really a genre. And so just because, I don't know, you have your Marios doesn't mean that the Call of Duties can't exist. And it doesn't mean that uh, games all have to be platformers or they all have to be walking simulators. And I think there's sort of a room at the table for everybody. And, I don't know, it's like there's people look for different things in the media they consume, and I think everything is great, and I think everything has merit and deserves to exist as it is.
Well, maybe more to the point. So if I said, Mario finds its meaning in jumping on stuff, and it's really fun to use the A button and you go up and down, and the game
Hmm.
simulates gravity. And in Call of Duty, the meaning is largely in the simulation of the weaponry, uh, however realistic or unrealistic it may be,
Hmm.
and being able to guide your cursor to strike an opponent in some way. So, where would you say the meaning lies in games like visual novels?
I think it's a good question. I think it's to experience a story. It's to sort of get to the end and to have an experience that you either enjoyed or you didn't enjoy. And because I'm trying not to say that, because some visual novels have choices, and so for some visual novels, I definitely can say the meaning is interacting with a fiction and being able to sort of guide it in one way or another, or have effects on the way the story is going. But also, some visual novels don't have choices. They're actually called kinetic novels, which is sort of experiencing a story almost in 3D, not 3D, but like with sound, music, and images being shown at you. Because a straight up book, you just have the words. And for a movie, it sort of goes at its own pace. But with like a visual novel, you can, you click your button and you can sort of like go at your own pace. But a movie sort of has its own pace that's asking you to keep up with. So I think maybe it's sort of its meaning is taking narratives and expanding them in another direction that games offers. Um, yeah.
That's an interesting reflection. Like, it's easy to see with Telltale style games, you get to pick, X person dies or whatever, and
Hmm.
that's kind of the meaning. What choice did you make? But even on the total non-interactive end of the spectrum, like you point out, you still have the choice of when to flip the page, and so
Yeah.
you're able to leverage all these audiovisual software benefits while at the same time giving the reader, I guess, control over how they navigate, even if it's a linear navigation,
Hmm. Yeah.
kind of giving them time to step their way through and really absorb the content.
Yeah. And I also know that a lot of like RPGs and other games almost have like built-in visual novel aspects in them. And I always love those types of games too. But I do know a lot of people who don't realize they like video games because they would enjoy those story aspects, but a lot of times the gameplay sort of asks you to come at it at a certain like skill level, and so it sort of like keeps people away that would probably otherwise enjoy the story. And so what I quite like about visual novels is it's taking the same story, but it's sort of taking out the aspects that might stop a player from being able to advance. And so giving them the story, all you have to do is click. And so I think hopefully that would open up games as a medium to even more people who might in the past might not have thought that it would be for them.
I guess in that sense, an RPG with a dense, complicated story kind of straddles its meaning on two legs, where you it's a dense story, so you need to be invested in the story, or otherwise you're going to fall asleep during the cutscenes. Why is it wasting your time with those? But also, you need to be invested in the combat system well enough to even get to the cutscenes. And so,
Yeah,
with visual novels, you're making the meaning more lean and focused.
yeah, and I think a lot of a lot of RPGs they sort of cut their gameplay and their story elements so differently so that it sort of feels a little jagged, sort of because I remember I was playing, there was a game called Odin Sphere that I quite love. And I love the story, but when I would ever get to the gameplay, it sort of felt like I'm like, okay, I want to get to the next story bit. I have to push a whole bunch of buttons to get to the story bit. And so whenever I was playing it, I wish I was experiencing more of the plot. And I played other games where the plot was not quite so good, and I was sort of like, okay, well, I don't want to listen to this plot. I want to get to the story. And so it sort of feels like they feel like two different worlds. And so I love it when games try to like bridge the gap of you doing something in a gameplay aspect that actually impacts the story later, that they don't seem so worlds apart.
Right, that you have that they kind of acknowledge each other and interlink in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining me. Are there any topics on your mind that you would like to cover that we haven't gotten to?
Uh, I just want to do a shameless plug for my other games. So I have a whole bunch of story-based. They're all free story-based games. Some of them are just straight visual novels. Some are straight visual novels with no choices, and some of them are visual novels mixed with sort of point-and-click elements. It's at my itch.io page at Heiden Heiden.itch.io, and they're all free to play. If you like the girl with the gray hair at Awakens, you should check them out too, because I didn't make them in 48 hours and they have better art and are more fleshed out.
All right. When it comes to video games, which would you say is the most important part? The intention of the designer, the game itself, or the experience of the player?
I think all three are important. Um, I mean, a designer has to sit down, they can sort of intend to have things happen, and then so they'll design a game and they have an intention, and then the game itself exists by itself, but the game sort of has to almost prove the designer's intention. But if a player sort of comes at the game and has their own ideas of what it means, they're almost sort of separate and they all sort of work together, um, which is probably not a very good answer, but I feel like it's really hard to sort of parse them apart because they all interlock so much.
Right, that, you know, uh, an art piece is, by its nature, a communication from one party to another, so.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you answer that way. I spoke yesterday with the developer of Yonko Battle, um, which is this competitive app for smartphones. And he mentioned that he thought the most important part was the game itself because basically, once he publishes the game, it's out in the world and people do with it what they will. But, he was making a competitive game where often, players play with each other and develop metagames and strategies that maybe the developer didn't even intend. Um, Whereas with something like a visual novel, there's very clearly like an intended meaning and kind of a maybe not one way to take the story, but a limited set of ways. Like uh, if you say
Yeah.
that the story is about a biker, that's wrong. But if you find some goofy exploit in a competitive game, then suddenly that's what the game's about because that's who you're playing with.
Yeah. And so I think even different genres of games might come at that question with different answers, because some games sort of rely a little bit more on the experience of the player, and then others are they don't quite they're a little bit more self-contained. So it's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.